Coming up today on the Nick Craig Show, about 70 days out from the elections, midterm elections, we'll take a look at the state of the United States Senate race here in North Carolina. Details on that and more coming up. And a good Monday morning to you. Welcome into the Nick Craig Show, streaming live this morning on YouTube, Rumble, X, and Facebook. Don't forget, if you miss any portion of the program, you can take it with you on demand 24/7 in your favorite podcast app. It's real simple and totally free to do so. Just search for the Nick Craig Show in your favorite podcast app or visit the website nickcraig.com. Our program this morning brought to you by Melissa Gott and her team over at the Law Group here in Wilmington. For any legal questions or challenges, lawgroupnc.com. We'll hear more from them coming up as we roll through this very busy Monday edition of the Nick Craig Show. We are going to be talking about the current state of the United States Senate race here in North Carolina. We are about 70 days away from Election Day. Early voting kicks off here mid-October. We are getting very close to the election turning into a sprint towards the finish. We'll jump into that in a very interesting piece I caught from The New Republic, which is a left-wing media publication here across the United States. Here's the headline: Dems are looking good in North Carolina, ... or are they? We'll dive into the details. Emma Jansen had that piece, and we'll get into that. But before we got to do an update on a couple of shows we did last week as it related to the WNBA. Last Monday, we talked about the current status of the WNBA, the disaster of a situation there. Late last week on Friday, we talked about it again as the WNBA is in this position where they are being forced to determine what a woman is, and didn't really anticipate on talking about that more in the coming months until something else came to fruition. And it in fact did yesterday evening, or last night I should say, as former NBA player Enes Kanter Freedom, who I told you last week had given his public declaration that he was going to be declaring for the WNBA draft coming up in April of next year. Kanter, a former NBA player, really pointing out the absurdity that the WNBA has created. He was ejected from Sunday night's game between the Indiana Fever and Chicago Sky. The Indiana Fever is where Caitlin Clark and Sophie Cunningham play, both of them stars of the WNBA, largely hated by the league. For whatever reason, I can't seemingly wrap my head around that. He showed up to the game, sat courtside with a t-shirt that read "Woman," noun, adult human female. Again, pointing out, and really, we're poking some fun at this and having a couple of laughs. And I want to make sure I make this point clear. The reason that this has become comical, the reason that this has become such an interesting story is because of the absurdity. The point of this is not to make fun of female sports. The point of this is not to poke fun and say women's sports are a joke. No, I don't believe that that's the case at all. But the only way I see to point out the absurdity that is existing right now within athletics, predominantly women and female athletics, is the road that we're going down. You have to force groups like the WNBA, force their back into the corner and make them define what a woman is. That is how screwed up these leagues are. That is how screwed up the conversation is right now. The only way to get them on record and make the claim that, yes, you have to be an actual woman, not pretending to be a woman, to participate in female sports, is to play out this exercise like we're seeing from Enes Kanter Freedom right now. So he was sitting courtside at a WNBA game wearing the shirt, "Women, adult human female." There was a timeout that was called, and that is when a player for the Chicago Sky by the name of Natasha Cloud walked over to Kanter and started yelling at him. He exclusively spoke with Outkick, which is a very prominent sports and media publication that was acquired by Fox News back just a couple of years ago. Clay Travis, the founder of Outkick, is no longer with Outkick. He's on a new project. But but rose Outkick to the prominence that it is right now. Kanter spoke exclusively with Outkick last night to lay out this situation. Take a listen to this.
Good question. So I was literally out there. I mean, I'm a huge fan of basketball, a huge fan of women's basketball, and I was there to watch the game, and I was really excited because I'm a huge fan of the Fevers, and so I was just literally just there to just watch the game, and then first half went amazing. I was having so much fun with my friends and stuff, and then it was towards the end of the third quarter. And Sophie Cunningham shot a three, and I put my hands up to celebrate, right? Literally, a couple position later, Natasha came back and started screaming and yelling and said, "She's not going to sleep with you." And I was like, I am not trying to sleep with her. I'm just here to protect women and support her. And then obviously, after that, she started yapping and she started to walk towards me. And literally, I just got up. And then I was like, I'm just here to protect women, and that's all, right? And then she started to yell. She started to use some very heavy language. She started to actually cuss. And I was very shocked that there were a lot of kids and there were a lot of teenagers was at that game. And I just cannot believe that she was just cussing and using those F-bombs in front of all these kids. And that is not, I mean, I'm sure like she's loved in Chicago and many kids and idolizing her and stuff, but that's not and a WNBA athlete should react, you know? And then anyway, and then after that, the security guy, came, and then I was like, listen, you need to leave. I was like, can you please tell me why do I need to leave? They said, look, you just need to leave. And then they literally, I don't want to say they dragged me, but like they pretty much like pushed me to leave the gym. And then after that, I had a conversation with the police officers, which I respect a lot. I was like, listen, I was just there to protect women.
So there's Enes Kanter speaking exclusively with Outkick after being kicked out of the game last night for showing up and, as he said, supporting a female athletics as the controversy with the WNBA continues. Great comment coming in. Is the what a woman issue just a distraction, or will this issue move voters away from the Democrats? It's a great question, and I don't believe it's the typical kind of distraction that we see as it relates to politics. This is a very polarizing issue, and I've read and listened to a lot of the discussion about this, and you have a lot of families, that people that are, and I think in large part maybe apolitical in what's going on. They have female daughters that are in middle school, in high school, participating in female sports, and their families are having to deal with this. Their families are having to play out and watch this nonsense unfold in front of their very eyes, and it has become a very polarizing issue. And the reason I don't think it's a distraction, and while it actually will hurt the Democrat Party moving forward, is because of that. You are taking regular, everyday, normal, non-political people who have children, who have young females in their families, who are going through the process, like many do in America, of participating in sports as a female, and are having to deal with this nonsense. And so I believe that this is truly a radicalizing moment for a lot of people, in a way in which we are watching this insanity play out in front of our very eyes. And we are seemingly over the last couple of months have seen major stories out of the WNBA time and time again that has nothing to do with the game. In this same game last night, where Enes Kanter Freedom was kicked out, Caitlin Clark went something like, she went like 8 for 11 or 8 from 12 from the three-point line and scored 28 points. That's a monster basketball performance. It's not talked about. It's completely overshadowed by the drama and the nonsense. I'm not going to make every show about the WNBA, obviously, as we continue towards the election cycle, but I do think that there are some major problems with these kinds of stories. And I do truly believe that it will have a major impact on politics as we continue to move forward. So that's the latest on the WNBA, the most recent controversy. Enes Kanter Freedom being kicked out of a WNBA game last night for sitting on the sideline and wearing a shirt, as he said, protecting female sports. We'll keep you up to date with the details right here on the Nick Craig Show. All right, into our major story of the day, the United States Senate race here in North Carolina. We've been talking about it a lot. We will continue to talk about it as we are T-minus 70 days until Election Day here, not only across the Tar Heel State, but across the rest of the nation in what will be a very important, a very influential midterm election. And I like to consider myself somebody that is able to read a room, look at a situation, and be honest about it. And being honest about it, the race between former Democrat Governor Roy Cooper and former head of the North Carolina Republican Party and head of the RNC, Michael Whatley, has really, to this point, not materialized in North Carolina the way in which myself and many other close political observers had thought. Polling has consistently shown, up until just the last day or two, a race that was not very close. Looking at some of the details over at Real Clear Politics, which I'll continue to remind you is a phenomenal resource if you want to dive into political polling. The Real Clear Politics average for this race currently gives Cooper an 8-point advantage. We saw a Carolina Journal poll last week, Cooper plus 13. A Carolina Forward poll the week prior, Cooper plus 7. Elon University, Cooper 11. Fox News conducted a poll back in the middle part of last month, 9-point advantage for Cooper. New York Times, Siena College back a few months ago, plus 7. This has been a race, at least polling wise, and again, you can't throw all of your stock into political polling. You can't look at this and say, this is 100% what's going to happen. This is the end result. We have seen over the last decade consistently how political polling does not always reflect what the end result is going to be. However, I think it is important to note that these polls have all shown a very similar story. They, in large part, have shown a race that I think many would describe as totally non-competitive. And let's be clear with this. Part of the reason that this race is playing out the way that it is Roy Cooper is a very popular individual. And I'm not saying he's popular in a good way, but he has nearly 100% name ID and recognition here in North Carolina. He just spent 8 years as the governor. During those 8 years, of which I believe he made a lot of very bad decisions, including a lot during COVID-19, regardless of whether you think those decisions were good or not, himself and his top health secretary, Mandy Cohen, who would then go and work for the Biden administration, were on television every single day during COVID. Similar to how Trump was hosting events every single day, Roy Cooper and Mandy Cohen were hosting press conferences at the Emergency Operations Center in Raleigh every single night. And of course, during the early onset of COVID-19 and the beginning of what was going on there, nobody was going to work. Very few people were. Everybody was stuck at home. Everything was shut down for that period of time right at the beginning of COVID. You really didn't have any other options. You really didn't have any other alternatives. Everybody wondering the same question. When are we going to be able to get life back to normal? When are we going to be able to go out and hang out with our friends and see our families and get back to work? All of these questions being asked, and you had the former governor, no surprise, and Roy Cooper on television almost every single day. And so for that reason, his name ID is nearly 100%, which is very uncommon in politics. Even the most popular elected officials in races like this have name IDs in the 70 or 80%, because frankly, there's just a lot of people that are totally disconnected from politics. There are a lot of people that could not care at all what is going on. They're not involved. They're not engaged. They have no idea what's happening. I think that's a problem, but it's a free country. If you don't want to take part in that process, that is your right to do so. I'm not going to be the political police to sit here and say, oh, well, you need to do this. It's a free country. If you don't want to be involved, that's your prerogative. I don't choose that to be the case. I don't believe that is necessarily a good idea. I don't think that is something that frankly makes a lot of sense. But again, that is your choice. That is your right. That is what you decide you do or don't want to do. But nevertheless, because that is the case, because of that nearly universal name ID, because of all of the media appearances and the fact that not only was he a 8-year governor, but has essentially spent 40 years in politics, because of that, well, everybody knows him. And so as we've watched this race in large part not materialize the way in which many people thought it was going to, it has drawn a very interesting question and drawn a very interesting conversation about what is this race truly going to look like? Is this going to be a bloodbath of an election for Republicans? Is this going to be a bloodbath election for Michael Whatley and the GOP? And if you were looking at the polling, that picture was starting to become a lot more clear. As I mentioned, we just saw a poll out from Carolina Journal last week or 2 weeks ago that showed Cooper had a 13-point advantage. An Elon University poll back less than a month ago, or a little more than a month ago, showing an 11-point advantage for Cooper. And even some of these other more close polls, Carolina Forward, which is a very left-wing group here in North Carolina, Cooper +7. That's not a close election. In a state like North Carolina, and I don't believe that North Carolina is a purple state. I think the idea that is the case is largely farcical. It's not the case at all. I think North Carolina is a state that may have been purple 15 or 20 years ago, but has consistently trended more red. And so if you had a Senate race in North Carolina and the final result is +8 for Roy Cooper, that would be a political earthquake. And so that's how this race has been playing out, at least in my mind. That is how things have looked from my vantage point. And so over the weekend, as I was kind of keeping an eye on what was going on, getting prepped to kick off another busy final week here of the month of August, I caught this very interesting article, this very interesting headline over at the New Republic. If you don't know what the New Republic is, I'm not going to fault you for that. It is a liberal left-wing publication that is, I believe they still do a couple of magazines. They do like one large magazine a month, but they're largely an online publication. And so the author of this piece in Emma Jansen wrote this headline: Dems are looking good in North Carolina, or are they? In today's newsletter, read about why Roy Cooper's polling advantage might not last. And then it goes into some of the other newsletter headlines and topics that were talked about in this, essentially this kind of daily briefing from the New Republic. And so it is opening the door from a left-wing publication standpoint to how this race might materialize. And that is going to be the million-dollar question. Is this a close election like we have traditionally seen with these major races in North Carolina, where we're looking at the winning candidate winning by as little as a couple thousand votes to a percentage point of, 2.5% to 3.5%, which is still a relatively close race, not a complete blowout? Or do we see something where it's a 7, 8, 9-point advantage for somebody like Roy Cooper? We'll dive into this article over at the New Republic coming up here in just a couple of minutes. But before that, I want to tell you about the law group here in Wilmington and thank them for their continued support of the program, and remind you that when legal challenges arise, make sure you put your trust in the law group right here in Wilmington. Since 2003, their experienced attorneys have provided high-quality, affordable legal services across eastern North Carolina. Whether you're facing a divorce, navigating a real estate transaction, or maybe you're in a position where you need a strong defense, no matter the issue, the law group has your back. Their dedicated team ensures your questions are answered and issues are resolved as quickly as possible. Great news, folks. They're not some big national law firm. Melissa Gott and her team live right here in southeastern North Carolina. Their office is located in downtown Wilmington, and they're just a phone call away at 910-251-6088, or you can visit them online at lawgroupnc.com. That's 910-251-6088, or online lawgroupnc.com. It's the Law Group. Experience and dedication you can rely on. We appreciate the Law Group and their continued support here of the Nick Craig Show. All right, quick break. We'll dive into this New Republic article coming up after this as the Nick Craig Show continues on this Monday morning, streaming live, YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook, and available 24/7 wherever you get your podcasts. And a good Monday to you. Welcome back to the Nick Craig Show. Don't forget that you can get access to our daily show notes and more, including our monthly Patreon hangout that is coming your way later this week. Head on over to patreon.com/Nick Craig. You can subscribe for as little as $5 a month. Patreon.com/Nick Craig. We'll be sending out the notice for that meeting coming up a little bit later on today. Patreon.com/Nick Craig. All right, back to our topic, our story of the day. An interesting article over at the New Republic, a left-wing, a self-described left-wing liberal news publication, with this headline: Dems are looking good in North Carolina, or are they? Political polling has not materialized in this race to the point where it has looked very competitive. We are T-minus 70 days until Election Day, so we're going to see things heat up pretty substantially over the next couple of months and see this race really start to form. And frankly, there has not been a lot of hope, a lot of good news if you are Michael Whatley, if you are a conservative activist, if you are somebody that is hoping that Republicans are able to hold on to the seat that was is currently held by retiring Senator Tom Tillis, a current Republican representing North Carolina in the United States Senate, it hasn't looked great. And so this article I found to be very interesting. Let's dive into a little bit of it, of this article. It reads, if Democrats want to take back the Senate, which I'll just jump in and note is not super likely, but nevertheless, if Democrats want to take back the Senate, they need North Carolina, their best chance to pick up a previously Republican-held seat, according to the Cook Political Report. So you'd think they'd be delighted. For months, polls have consistently put former Democrat Governor Roy Cooper ahead of his opponent, former Republican National Committee Chair Michael Whatley. But Cooper's campaign is on edge, and experts say it should be. Whatley could still win this race. Now, the question based on this article, is this a psyop by the New Republic? Is this something to make sure that Democrats don't get complacent? Is this something that Democrats are putting out to kind of as a clarion call, rallying cry for Democrats to make sure that they don't get fat, dumb, and happy and complacent with a slam dunk victory in this race? I don't know. And as we read through it, maybe that'll become more clear. It writes, in early August, a Harper poll, that was the Carolina Journal poll, survey of likely voters found Cooper up by 13 points against Whatley in the race to replace retiring GOP Senator Tom Tillis. A Change Research poll of likely voters from around the same time had Cooper up by 7 points. 50% of respondents said they'd vote for Cooper, 43% for Whatley, and 6% were undecided. Those undecided voters could be where Whatley finds his margin of victory. According to Jason Husser, a professor at Elon University and the director of the Elon poll, in which showed a much more competitive race, told the New Republic, quote, "I think that polls at this stage of the race, when we're still a couple of months out from the election, in a race that will have a very difficult to predict turnout, should be taken with a grain of salt." Now, this is interesting. This isn't just some random politico making this comment. Jason Husser is the director of polling at Elon University here in North Carolina. He is saying that polls this far out should be taken with a grain of salt. That is interesting insight from somebody that you would consider to know what they're talking about as it relates to political polling. He went on to tell the New Republic, quote, "The race is far from over, and we have seen historical precedent of Republicans surging at the last couple of weeks in the state." And that is, in fact, very true. And the New Republic highlights this. In the 2016 U.S. Senate race, for example, Republican candidate Richard Burr launched a barrage of effective attack ads against Democrat Deborah Ross towards the end of the campaign and ultimately won. In the 2014 Senate election, Tillis was trailing Democrat Kay Hagan in the vast majority of polls, only to win by 1.5 percentage points. In Cooper's run for governor in 2016, polls consistently showed him leading by at least 2 percentage points, but he only won by 10,000 votes. The article goes on to say, the Cooper campaign is particularly concerned that a recent Supreme Court decision on campaign finance spending will help Whatley's campaign. The decision says that political parties can now coordinate directly with campaigns and raise unlimited funds. Since the RNC has a major cash advantage over the Democratic National Committee, which, by the way, is currently in the red, is currently in significant amounts of debt, Republican candidates could get bigger infusions of cash this cycle. And so that's very interesting. And that, of course, was that, I believe it was the Citizens United case that changed some of that decision from the United States Supreme Court that changed some of those rules as it relates to campaign finance at the federal level. That is an important point. And let's make sure, and I know there's a lot of new folks here in North Carolina, maybe a lot of folks that have been here for a while, but are now getting more politically engaged and politically in tune. While, again, as I noted a little while ago, I don't believe that North Carolina is a purple state. I believe it's more leaning red than it is purple at this point. Elections, for the most part, and there are, of course, outliers, right? You look at the very flawed candidate in Mark Robinson, who got blown out by Josh Stein in November of last year, or November of 2024, excuse me. We have seen races that have been what I would call outliers. But typically those are, in the case of the Mark Robinson race, where there is just so much damning news and information coming out just weeks ahead of the election that there's really no way to come back from that. Outside of a situation like that with a major controversy leading up until Election Day, these statewide races, whether we're talking about a U.S. Senate race, whether we're talking about a governor race, whether we're talking about Council of State races, whether it's the state auditor or the state treasurer, so on and so forth, these statewide elections, these things are pretty close. I mean, we just saw in 2024 the race between Allison Riggs and Jefferson Griffin for the North Carolina Supreme Court. That race, when it was all said and done, was decided by just a couple thousand votes. A statewide election. We saw current Chief Justice Paul Newby of the North Carolina Supreme Court winning his race back years ago by just 401 votes. In a statewide election, there are more than 7.6 million registered voters in North Carolina. And in many of these races, you see 4.5, 5.5 million people showing up to vote. And in the race like the Paul Newby race, that is that was the statewide election, meaning if you were all out the far west half of North Carolina, up on the Virginia border, on the South Carolina border, or on the Atlantic Ocean, it didn't matter where you lived in North Carolina, that was a race that you saw on your ballot, like you'll see this year with some of the Supreme Court races coming up as well. And so with all of that being said, races traditionally in this state have been pretty close. They have been. It is very infrequent that we see a major electoral victory on a statewide race. Now, you get into the congressional races, which are districted, and there's major advantages for Democrats in some areas, major advantages for Republicans in other areas. It's a different story. You boil it down even further to the North Carolina General Assembly. There's a lot of very strong districts that go both ways there. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about no districts, statewide. If you live in the state of North Carolina, if you are a legal resident, if you are registered to vote, you are voting in this contest. We traditionally have seen races that have outcomes of anywhere from 1 to about 3.5%. That has been the norm. That has been the consistent standard. And so the $1 million question that myself and so many others in the political landscape are asking right now is, will this be that kind of race? Or will this be what would be very abnormal in the Tar Heel state, an electoral bloodbath? Would this be a runaway, or could this be a runaway election for Democrats? Or vice versa, and it doesn't seem likely, but a runaway election for Republicans, which statistically and historically in recent years has not really happened. And so that is, I think, the premises of this article and some of these other details that you've seen flowing out of this race over the last couple of weeks. We are rounding out the conversation on essentially the state of North Carolina's Senate race about 70 days ahead of Election Day here in North Carolina. We are getting very close to turning this election from more of a longer race to a sprint towards the finish line. Political polling has shown in recent months very strong advantages for the former 8-year governor, 40-year elected official here in North Carolina, Roy Cooper, and a very interesting piece over at the left-wing publication, The New Republic, that ran late last week that is maybe signaling potentially some warning signs for the Cooper campaign and for Democrats here in North Carolina in a race that seemed to be very squarely in their advantage. Back to the article. Jeff Allen, the Cooper for North Carolina campaign manager, said in a statement to the New Republic, quote, "The RNC has been stockpiling their money because they know that their former chairman, Michael Whatley, would need to get bailed out. Whatley's elite DC connections and party loyalty means he's first in line for the RNC's nearly $130 million war chest. The Supreme Court just guaranteed that this race will be among, if not, the most expensive in the country." Despite that, the New Republic writes, Cooper remains ahead in direct campaign fundraising, significantly ahead, having raised $35 million to Whatley's $16 million. Outside group spending is in full force. In late July, the Senate Leadership Fund, which is a GOP super PAC, announced that it was spending $17 million on an ad buy attacking Cooper's record on crime as governor. While Cooper's campaign is focused on affordability, he's been touring the state on the Make Stuff Cost Less tour. Whatley has been hammering on crime and public safety. And of course, very relevant here in North Carolina on Saturday, we crossed the 1 year mark of the horrific, the brutal, the disgusting murder of Irina Zarutska aboard the Charlotte light rail, minding her own business, leaving work at a pizzeria in uptown Charlotte, jumping on the light rail to get home after a day of work, only to be viciously and brutally murdered by DeCarlos Brown Jr., a mentally ill, longtime criminal who Democrats in Charlotte allowed consistently back on the street. Democrat policies, like of which are pushed by former Governor Roy Cooper, allowed somebody like DeCarlos Brown Jr. to roam the streets of Charlotte and kill Irina Zarutska. And so that crime message and public safety message is one that absolutely resonates. I think it is fair to say that over the last 12 months, the Irina Zarutska story was the largest story here in North Carolina in terms of a story that got much more broad attention. I mean, there are literally international newspapers that talked about that story. I think that is a fair assessment. And for Roy Cooper, he and the Democrats have to own a lot of that. Back to the New Republic article. Big ad spends could help Whatley with undecided voters and voters who don't know who he is, which is a major problem. After serving in state government for 38 years, with 8 years as governor, 92% of voters are familiar with Cooper, while just 69% are familiar with Whatley. I go back to that nearly 100% name ID. Everybody knows who Roy Cooper is. That is not the same way, not the same case with Michael Whatley. Back to a Jeff Husser from Elon University. He says, if we just look at the subset of voters who have high levels of familiarity with Michael Whatley, this race looks pretty competitive. And so instead of it being a 10-point Cooper blowout, it's starting to look like a typical North Carolina nail-biter. Backing up again this commentary that this could be a much closer, a very competitive race. Husser found that voters' familiarity with Whatley increased by 15 points over the course of the summer, a big-time advantage there. A July public policy or PPP survey found the closest margin yet, with 48% saying they'd vote for Cooper and 44% saying they'd choose Whatley. But the poll also found that Democrats are almost completely lined up behind Cooper, while a lot of Republican voters remain undecided. That gives Whatley much more room for growth, PPP noted in their press release. That's exactly the kind of analysis that should worry Cooper's campaign, writes Emma Jansen, the author of this piece over at the New Republic. So let's round this out. What does all of this mean? Well, I take a couple of things away from this. Running against Roy Cooper was always going to be an uphill battle. This was always going to be a very tough race for Republicans. You are, again, looking at a guy that has nearly universal name ID. Contrary to what I think and contrary to what many of you listening today think, Roy Cooper is very popular. There are a lot of people in the state of North Carolina, those that are not even Democrats or liberals, that like Roy Cooper, that think Roy Cooper did a good job. Why is that the case? Well, I'll go back to one of my favorite topics, our incredibly biased, incredibly left-wing media here in the state of North Carolina that frankly did not cover the Roy Cooper controversies, that frankly did not hammer him the way that he should have. And I'm not saying hammer him because he's a Democrat, hammer him because he screwed things up. He's the state's governor. He was the top dog for 8 years. He deserves a high level of scrutiny, a high level of criticism. I am a strong believer, regardless of political affiliation, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, progressive, it doesn't matter. If you are in a position of power, if you are an elected official at any level, but especially at the highest levels, like the governor of one of the largest states in the nation, you should have people with a microscope constantly looking at you. The reality is one that is very bleak here in North Carolina from a media standpoint. It doesn't exist. WRAL, the News and Observer, the Charlotte Observer, all of these other left-wing television stations across North Carolina, they're not interested in talking about things like NCORE. Have you heard of it before? The North Carolina Office of Resiliency and Recovery. There are still people in eastern North Carolina that have been without homes for a decade. It has been 10 years since NCORE started this process of getting people back in their homes after Hurricanes Matthew and Florence. That was a pet project, Roy Cooper's baby when he was the governor. 10 years, and there are people still living in hotels, still living in temporary housing. That is an abject failure of government. That is an abject failure of Roy Cooper. Nobody knows about it. Nobody knows about it. Unless you are one of these affected people or follow North Carolina politics very closely, you have never heard of NCORE. You've never heard of this entity. You've never heard of the controversy. Why? Because the friendly Democrat left-wing media here in North Carolina has not been interested in covering it. So what is the state? How do things stand right now? This is going to be an uphill battle for Michael Whatley. You're running against a very popular, very well-known individual in Roy Cooper. And I'll use this as an opportunity for those that are conservative, those who lean right on the political spectrum. This is your warning sign to get involved. Do not sit on the sideline. Do not post on social media all day and believe that you're actively involved in the process. Get involved in this race. Get involved in other influential and important races that are taking place here across North Carolina, whether it's your local school board or your local county commission or your members of the North Carolina General Assembly. In a midterm election year that should favor the Democrats, every single conservative, every single Republican like-minded individual needs to get off the sideline and get involved in these races. Whether it's donations, whether it's volunteer efforts, whether it's specific talents that you bring, time, treasure, and talent. Those are the three things that make political campaigns roll. You've got to get involved in this process. We are 70 days away from Election Day. We are going to see things heat up dramatically as we approach Labor Day here coming up in September. We'll be keeping a very close eye on this race, the most comprehensive coverage of not only the United States Senate race, but all these other races here in North Carolina, right here on the Nick Craig Show. Quick heads up for those in southeastern North Carolina, as we have seen some wild weather over the last couple of days. A tornado warning in northern New Hanover County on Friday. We are looking at the possibility once again today of some strong storms in the afternoon. The Storm Prediction Center once again putting a small but still meaningful tornado and wind and hail risk for southeastern North Carolina. So the summer heat, the summer storms continue across the southeast half of the state. We're also seeing some things in the tropics begin to heat up in what should be a relatively less active than usual Atlantic hurricane season. So we're watching those things on a couple of fronts as well. Be mindful if you're joining us live here on just past 7:44 on this Monday morning. Some possibility of some strong to severe storms, even a potential tornado coming up later on this afternoon. Make sure you're make sure you're aware of that, and make sure you have the ability to get any of those breaking storm alerts if things do materialize as we head into the afternoon hours. All right, that's going to do it for a Monday edition of the Nick Craig Show. Thanks to the Law Group here in Wilmington for their continued support. LawGroupNC.com or 910-251-6088. The Nick Craig Show streams live weekday mornings, 7 a.m., YouTube, Rumble, X, Facebook, available 24/7 in your favorite podcast app, and heard weeknights, 9 to 10 p.m. on WBT Radio in Charlotte. Enjoy your Monday. We'll do it again tomorrow morning right here on the Nick Craig Show.